Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh Strife Hayes and I love MMORPGs. I've played them for the majority of my life and collectively have spent tens of thousands of hours inside virtual worlds. After my extensive time gaming and living through so many online games, I've come to realise there are a few problems present in the MMORPG world. This is a series of videos discussing what's ruining the MMORPG genre. Today, why having too many MMORPGs to choose from ruins MMORPGs. As usual, that's a very extreme statement. I'm sure some of you are thinking, we have more MMORPGs than ever to choose from, and surely that's a good thing. Choice can't possibly be bad, can it? Well, as usual, if you give me some time, I'd like to explain why it's actually more complex than just good and bad. There's some science, some psychology, and then some cold, hard maths, working behind the scenes to affect the situation in ways we may not instantly see. I'd like you to understand, I do not want people to stop taking risks. I do not want companies to be afraid of making new MMORPGs. I love the genre, and I want it to succeed. But I do believe a constantly increasing number of average MMOs being released is a negative thing for the genre in general. Let's begin by talking about how many MMORPGs there are. Most of you will be familiar with the Big Five: World of Warcraft, Guild Wars 2, Elder Scrolls Online, Final Fantasy XIV, and Old School RuneScape. And while these games combined do control a dominant market share, the actual number of current active MMORPGs is insane. If we don't include Chinese or Eastern-only games, we'll be looking in the hundreds. If we open up that number to include games only available in the Eastern market, it jumps up to the thousands. I searched for hours to get an exact number, and there are so many MMORPGs available, no one actually knows the exact active number. Depending on how broad you extend the definition to, you jump between 500 and 5,000 games. For the sake of this video, let's be extremely conservative and say there are only 100 currently active MMOs you could download and play right now. That number is far lower than reality, but it's just going to be used to illustrate the examples of the problems it would cause, and 100 is a nice round number. So, with our hypothetical, extremely conservative estimate of 100 MMORPGs, with a few of them dominating the market, how could that ever be a bad thing? Surely out there, within that 100, is your perfect game. Or by trying them all, you can find the ideal. Or if you don't like a small aspect of one, you can jump to a similar one without that aspect. Well, these are all correct, and all are very destructive parts of the paradox of choices. There are three specific problems that come with a large amount of choices. I'm going to explain each of them and then link them to MMORPGs. Here we go. Number 1. Choice overload, also referred to as overchoice. Overchoice is a psychological term coined by Alvin Toffler in the 1970 book Future Shock. Put simply, it refers to the feeling or emotional process a person experiences when faced with an abundance of choices. As humans, we're not actually equipped to deal with a large amount of potential choices, so our brains do odd things whenever we're forced to look at a wide selection of anything. To relate this to a real-world example we can likely all identify with, imagine you're in the supermarket shopping for pasta sauce, standing in the pasta sauce aisle, and you have two choices: red sauce or white sauce. That's it. You have to simply choose a single sauce from the choice of red or white. This isn't going to take too long. You can debate all day if you want to, but eventually you're going to have to make one of these choices. Even people who struggle to make decisions will eventually settle on one side or the other. Even if you're not totally happy with one source or the other, you will have a definite favourite, as when presented with a choice of only two things, you will be able to work out which side you favour. Whichever you choose may not be your ideal source. You may add extra ingredients when you get home, or maybe you dislike both and so choose the one you hate the least. But you will have a clear preference. This smaller choice, red or white, makes your final decision much simpler. One day, however, you come into the supermarket and there are over 100 different types of pasta sauce. Original red and white still exist, but now there's every possible variation you can think of. Spicy or mild, chunky or smooth, mixed. Every combination is here. You may think this would be a good thing. More choice means you can now find your ideal perfect sauce. But while your perfect sauce may indeed exist, the process of finding it is about to get a lot more difficult due to two psychological things: analysis paralysis and FOMO, or fear of missing out. Analysis paralysis is a catchy term for how we as humans tend to spend so long focusing on a decision we forget to actually make the decision. When there are multiple factors involved, and each factor affects multiple others, a decision can become so mind-bendingly complex we spend hours, days, weeks or months obsessing over every small detail, because every other detail increases it by a factor of 10 on the complexity scale. If you've ever experienced the inability to make a choice in real life due to how complex the choice had become, you have experienced the cold, hard, stop you in your tracks and prevent any progress grip of analysis paralysis. The second problem is fear of missing out, often shortened to FOMO. This is a cognitive paradox where humans often spend more time thinking about what they've given up or left behind and less time focusing on what they actually have. In the first example, two sources. We chose a source and left a source behind. We had one thing and we did not have one thing. It's equal. Our brain can balance this. But now, with 100 sources, we're going to be taking one home and leaving 99 behind. This is a huge imbalance and leads our minds down a path of what if? What if another was better? What if I got mild when I should have got slightly milder? What if I made the wrong choice? Because mathematically, that's highly likely. If you've ever spent more time thinking about something you don't have, or something you had to pass up on in order to have what you do have, and this has ruined the process of actually having something else, you've retroactively experienced the horrible fear of missing out. To relate this issue and two problems back to MMORPGs, you as a player have 100 hypothetical games to choose from. This means 100 games to look at, read about, research, agonize over, sort into categories and debate which is worth your time. And when you've managed to overcome the analysis paralysis you'll likely be thrown into while making the decision, while you stare at the download bar and watch the game install, you'll have to avoid the creeping thoughts of, hey, maybe this isn't the right game. Maybe the other games that look similar but had a different PvP system is better. Or maybe this isn't going to be as good as the others. You'll be bombarded with the fear of missing out. You'll see this in action all the time. Reddit is flooded with "what should I play" threads on the MMORPG subreddit, and most people respond with any of the big five, and people still can't pick. A choice of 5 major popular MMORPGs, and we're still unable to pick. It truly is a human flaw that when presented with a choice of anything beyond one answer, we struggle so much to pick one and commit to it. But let's say you can get past that. You pick a game and download it and start playing. Now you're going to run into the second problem. Number 2. Vote splitting, or how similar games divide communities. This is a major issue in politics that will now begin applying to MMORPGs. It actually applies to absolutely anything that involves choices and people who must choose, but I'll explain using a political analogy. Imagine two politicians. Let's call them A and B. A is receiving 40% of the votes and B the remaining 60%. B is clearly going to win. This seems fair so far. Now imagine a third politician got involved. We'll call them C. C is incredibly similar to B. They share a majority of opinions and are both equally opposed to A. This means that when the next vote happens, none of A's supporters are going to vote for either B or C, leaving A with the original 40%. However, the remaining 60% of people have now become split equally between B and C, because they're so similar, but differ on a few minor issues. They share a voter base. This changes the results to B and C each receiving 30% each, because having additional choices strengthened the specifics of each individual voter, but weakened each candidate running that was similar to another. A ends up winning, despite only holding 40%. This is a complex political debate and also the reason why so many smaller political parties are funded by their political opponents. But that's not what we're here to discuss. I'd like to link this back to MMORPGs. If only 2 MMORPGs existed, you'd play the one you like the most. If a third is introduced, it would steal players from the game most similar to it. As more games are created, they split the community already similar to them and divide the player base down. The amount of MMORPG players may be increasing slowly, but the rate the community is being split into subsections is also increasing. Just as with the politician example, each new game is pulling in a smaller and smaller number of players, and each new game is then unable to survive or win with such a small player base. You only need to look at the huge number of failed MMORPGs recently to see that creating something similar to what already exists doesn't draw new players in. It simply displaces and reassigns already existing players, weakening both the original game they left and not strengthening the game they moved to enough to win. You end up with 2 weak games instead of one consolidated good one. To continue with the example of you downloading a game from the selection of 100, you're now faced with the reality that the general player base of MMOs is also divided between these 100, and whenever a new game arrives or a major change is made that causes players to leave, they'll switch to a new one, becoming a self-sustaining cycle of damaging a game by leaving, but never quite leaving in large enough numbers to actually create a sustainable new game. The process of weakening something by creating something similar and dividing the user base is known as vote splitting. And with the continued creation of MMORPGs beyond those original 100 that we're hypothetically dealing with, it will continually happen. The irony of this process is those new games don't weaken games that are nothing like them. The sci-fi MMORPG Eve is nothing like the fantasy MMORPG Lord of the Rings Online. So when Lord of the Rings Online was released, it's unlikely to take too many of Eve's players. This is why I find it impossible to believe any game that claims to be a World of Warcraft killer. Because unless you're trying to be similar to World of Warcraft, you're not actually going to split their community. You're going to pull players from whatever game you're most similar to. which in turn will weaken that game that you are displacing players from, not sustain your game enough, and make World of Warcraft proportionally even stronger. But let's say you're here, there's enough people playing, the community isn't split by a new contender appearing. Now you'll have to deal with the worst psychological fallacy. 3. The illusion of the ideal, or how searching for personal perfection leads to loneliness. This is one of the worst things that excess choice brings. It's the extreme theoretical endpoint of the second problem. Humans have a need to connect. We're social animals. The MMORPG itself is a social facilitator, so we crave and enjoy company. While some of you may claim to be antisocial, the vast majority of humans desire human contact. This means that when presented with limited choices, we make do with the choice and then connect with others who also made the same choice. We have shared experiences. To bring it back to the pasta sauce example, you'd have two camps, red sauce versus white sauce. This would lead to community cohesion. You're either on one side or the other. This isn't a conflict of ideals or morality, it's a choice of sauce, and so can lead to fun or light-hearted communities each relating to or teasing the other. This is why World of Warcraft has Horde versus Alliance. It's about creating a community by allowing you to feel like you belong. If you belong to one side or the other, you're part of a group, which is an essential part of the human experience. The fewer groups you can choose between, the larger each individual group becomes, and the more likely you are to find people who are part of your group. Even if you don't like everything about the game you play, that now ceases to matter. You as a human can deal with the slight annoyances of the game because it's become something greater than itself. It's not a game anymore, it's a social structure. Friends and allies and rivals have been created by this game, and you feel involved in a way the game itself could never provide. It's connected you to people, and that's a memorable and beautiful experience. This is why when people talk about the olden days of MMORPGs, classic World of Warcraft, EverQuest, Asheron's Call, RuneScape, as being so brilliantly social, as there were fewer choices and therefore each choice had a larger percentage of the total player base, creating new and sustainable communities. The games took second place to the player communities inside them. If you only had 2 or 3 MMORPGs to choose from, you're guaranteeing each game has a large group of players, and you're highly likely to find someone from your group to talk to and connect with. But with an increase in games, we've already spoken about how it splits and splits. This then causes something far worse: the personal search for the perfect personal game. If the game had a brilliant community, you'd be willing to overlook a few small flaws, but now we're starting to wrongly believe if we're not happy with something, we can find an alternative. Instead of just accepting that not every aspect of your most liked game will be perfect for everyone, you're beginning to look for a game with absolutely everything flawless, just the way you like it. This leads to the situation where you're logically going to end up with every single MMORPG player playing a different MMORPG. A perfect, personally tailored experience that contains every game mechanic they individually love in just the right amount for them. This leads to the paradox of never ever having the possibility of being multiplayer, because every other player possible is off playing their own personal perfect game. If you as a player believe that an MMORPG exists that will meet every one of your needs and contain everything you love and none of the things you hate, you'll constantly jump from game to game, searching for the impossible, and never realizing that perfection wasn't what made MMORPGs great. It was a small number of games bringing together a large number of people, not a large number of games bringing together a small number of people. To bring this back full circle to the supermarket pasta sauce, while each person may, in time, find their ideal sauce, you won't have the communities you used to have, because each person is just enjoying their own perfect sauce. You end up with a large number of perfectly satisfied, yet extremely lonely people. To relate this to a personal example, I have many friends who play MMORPGs, but very few of them are willing to compromise and play any other MMORPGs. So instead of 5 or 6 people meeting up inside a game we're willing to tolerate, adventuring together through a shared world and making stories, we have 5 or 6 people adventuring alone, each of them inside their own perfect game that brings them everything except company. So how do we fix these problems? That's a hell of a question. I don't like thinking I'm against progress, but every time I hear of a new MMORPG coming out, or the hype for a new game building, I'm reminded of these 3 issues. It's going to be another game new players have to consider and analyse. It's going to split the current community of the game most similar to it, and it's feeding into the belief that eventually a perfect game for you will happen. Every new MMORPG release affects the MMORPG landscape, and while the success stories like Guild Wars 2 and Elder Scrolls Online were successful enough to actually survive, there are many, many more that split the community and then simply die. The reason these 2 became successful was either because they had a massive IP behind them, such as the Elder Scrolls, or they had a payment method that players could agree with, Guild Wars 2 being buy to play and now free to play with paid expansions. I feel any new MMORPG needs to do something different to make an impact. A new payment model, a famous established fictional world explored in a new way, or a stylistic choice so different to anything currently out there it brings in players from outside the MMORPG player base, not simply steals them from the game most similar to it. As always, thank you very much for watching. What are your opinions? Do you feel more choice is a good, bad, or irrelevant thing in the world of MMORPGs? Leave a comment down below or come speak to me live. I'm usually streaming various games nightly over on Twitch at twitch.tv/Josh Strife Hayes. Thank you very much for your time and have a great day.